I would like to welcome each of you today to our second faculty lecture in honor of the Department of Black Studies here at the University of Nebraska, Omaha's 50th anniversary. My name is Deborah Hurd, and I am the project coordinator for the 50th anniversary. The department was established in 1971, following 2 years of demands and student protests, culminating in the arrest of the Omaha 54 UNO students who were arrested for sitting in the chancellor's office on November 10th, 1969. As a result of their efforts, the support of other students and student groups, but also the mobilization of the Black community here in Omaha, civic and social organizations, churches, and just regular people, this department exists. And because of their continued support, this department continues to exist. We acknowledge that this university sits on the sacred tribal lands of the Native American people whose name was given to this city, the Omaha, and of the other First Nation people who regarded this land as their communal homeland. We stand in solidarity with you. In the spirit of freedom and liberation out of which this department and this discipline emerged, we stand in solidarity with the people of Sudan, who just yesterday suffered a military takeover. This coming after a revolution in which the people fought for their right to determine the direction of their country and their lives. We stand in solidarity with the people who only want to live, work, and exist freely and in peace. We support you, stand with you, and pray for the triumph of justice, freedom, liberation, and peace, the principles upon which Maat is founded. Reverend Dr. Nikitah Imani is a professor and former chair of the Department of Black Studies here at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. He earned a bachelor's degree in international politics, law, and organization from the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University, a master's in political science from the University of Florida, and another master's and then PhD in sociology, also from the University of Florida. Dr. Imani is the author of several books and articles and considers himself to be an Africa-centered international political sociologist. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Imani.
Thank you so much, Professor Hurd, for having me today.
So before I turn it over to you, I'm going to pose a few questions. So you grew up in Georgia and did your graduate training in institutions in the South. So this is a two-part question. How did your experience growing up and being in and around cities with sizable or majority Black populations shape your concept and your engagement with Black studies? And then how has your experience been just growing up and studying in the South in general shaped your concept and your engagement with Black studies?
Okay. Well, to begin with, I was born and raised in Atlanta. My parents, adopted parents, were from rural Georgia, that rural part of Georgia between, Georgia and right at the Georgia-South Carolina border. And so I'm a unique individual in the sense that many of my family members were rural residents, and then you had some who had transitioned into the urban environment. The time period in which, I come to know myself and begin to manifest my own energies as a human being is a period where we're coming out of the civil rights movement and moving into what was going to become the Black Power phase. And so I was born in the middle of that. Everyone was involved in one way or another with activism. So there was this tremendous legacy of the civil rights movement, being in Georgia and being in the place where Elijah Muhammad had come and Martin Luther King had come and other important figures had come. The legacy of people like Booker T. Washington and others in terms of historically Black colleges and universities, the role of the Black church, all of this was front and center in the environment, in the context in which I was reared. So I always tell people, I never had a choice to join the movement. There was never a point where I signed the sheet. I think there are some people who tell that story when I decided to join. My grandmother asked me at a very young age, what are you going to do for the people? So I guess that was my sign up. It wasn't an option. I was going to play a role for the people. The issue was, what role was that going to be? And in terms of, how that positioned me with respect to the discipline, I didn't know initially about the discipline itself, but I knew that I was going to be doing what it is that the discipline was doing. That is to say, I was an activist first. I joined the Junior Panthers. I grew up around people that were in every phase of the movement, from the Republic of New Africa. Some people were fighting for essentially the separation of Southern states that would be turned over to African people. I had other people that were Garvey repatriationists who were interested in going back to the continent. But the idea was that there had to be a fundamental change in the relationship between African people and the larger society, and that even though civil rights had made some progress, civil rights had not really adjusted that. Malcolm X became one of my early heroes in terms of activism, because he made the case that you can get civil rights, which are rights under the Constitution and the legal framework of the society, but that still doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have all of the social, political, and economic resources that you need as a community to survive, and your identity as a human being. And I was really persuaded by that, and that's kind of what led me to pursue kind of international relations and the internationalization of the African struggle. I became a Pan-Africanist. I got deeply involved in the struggle in South Africa and in Namibia and in every other part of the continent where there were struggles against colonialism, neo-colonialism, whatever. And I saw my role here in Babylon as playing this facilitator role in terms of getting resources and helping people on the continent. So I committed to Garveyism very early. And I still maintain that perspective. I said one time when I was young, I want to be Malcolm X with a PhD. And I think that was kind of my approach to it. Was I wanted to be the activist and related to the people and involved in the community the way Malcolm X was. I admired that. But at the same time, many of the people that I was raised around, they critiqued Malcolm X, and they raised up people like Dr. King and others because they had the scholarly credibility to put the academic and intellectual framework to what they were talking about. And I'm like, we need to be able to do that. So I'm going to do that. Now, of course, at the time, I didn't know that there was people beginning to conceptualize a discipline and a framework for doing that. But the minute I became aware of Black studies, I was Black studies without portfolio. And I just kind of walked around until I could officially kind of get connected. One of my first experiences was Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop actually had a guest lecture when I was a child. He came to Morehouse College, and I didn't understand the significance of it, but I heard that he was the last pharaoh, was what they were calling him at the time. And I'm like, I don't know who this is, but I want to find out about him. And Diop's books and Diop's perspectives, I'm not alone in saying that he changed my whole world. And he did. And then I began reading students of Diop and others. And I think in many ways, Diop starts the modern movement towards what ultimately would crystallize into, a formal intellectual Black studies or Africana studies, or however people choose to characterize it. So that's my stab at answering the complex question.
So what are some of your other research interests or projects? So you're going to talk to us today about one of your newer projects, but what are some of your other research interests or projects?
Well, I would say my research is in three different categories. One is institution building for African people. My first two books, Kazanzi and Mbongi, were about how do we build political, judicial, dispute resolution institutions that are grounded in our own cultural tradition. That's one. The other is, I've always been a computer geek, and I'm very much into data visualization and GIS kind of research. And so I'm interested in the connection between land and people, spatial variables and sociological variables. So I do work in that area as well. I think a lot of times the way in which we behave and the way in which we think has a lot to do with the environmental and architectural context that we live in. And I'm going to touch on that today in many ways, because we believed historically that architecture mattered, not simply because you were housing something, but the shape and the form and the design of the architecture had to be consistent with the spiritual nature of what it is that you were going to house inside that structure. So you know, that's a second thing. So I look at where African people are, and I look at the social behavior and the social statistics, and I talk about how we need to transform the environment to transform the behavior. The last part of what I do is, and of course, I think we all do this in Black Studies. I think this is like something that gets added to your resume regardless, and that is the beating down of misinformation. And I say that there's two kinds of misinformation, which is stuff that comes from outside and stuff that comes from inside. And there are unique challenges to dealing with both. The stuff that comes from outside, of course, sometimes that's a little easier to combat, because the minute you say it came from outside, everyone goes, okay, well, yeah, maybe that's naturally suspicious. But the real challenge for me has been dealing with people who associate themselves with the movement, with Black studies, with Afrocentrism, with whatever it is they associate with, which looks positive. But then underneath it, there are fundamental ideological and historical assumptions that are not factual. And sometimes having to deal with that battle is even more of a challenge than having to deal with, say, some Eurocentric scholar from somewhere.
All right. And so my last question, and you mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop. Who are some of your influences or people that you look up to in Black studies?
I was privileged to be a McKnight doctoral fellow. Most of you have probably never heard of that. It's a graduate doctoral fellowship program in Florida. And basically you go to any institution in the state of Florida, and you're eligible for this fellowship. And it's primarily targeting so-called people of color, and especially at that historical point in time, African Americans. But there was a bit of a caveat in that it was unlike any other doctoral program, in that it was run by some people who had come out of the movement and the Panthers. And so they felt that their goal was to create revolutionary scholars for the next generation. So I went to the conference every year, like you would go in any doctoral conference, but I was regularly meeting with Dr. Ben, Dr. John Henry Clark, who was on our board of directors, Dr. Naeem Akbar, Dr. Marimba Ani, Dr. Asa Hilliard. Young people don't even know who I'm talking about, but I'm sitting there just absolutely having all of my theoretical and philosophical and methodological approaches completely reworked every single year. You know, and Dr. Clark at a very young scholar age said to me, he said, I'm not concerned about who's coming, I'm concerned about who's coming to do the work. And so he challenged all of us in our various disciplines, and we came from all disciplines, to be revolutionary, to be African about your discipline, and to pick up some part of the work that our scholarly elders had left. And I would say they are all. I like to say that I'm the bastard child of Dr. Ben and Dr. Clark and Dr. Hilliard, who was in Georgia, Georgia State for a long time. So I was constantly around him. And I was just buried. There was also something called the National African American Student Leadership Conference that I got involved in at Russ College in Mississippi. And again, it would be the same crew of luminaries. And the funny thing about it is, at the time, I didn't think I was that privileged. I mean, I knew I was privileged in terms of, gosh, I'm meeting great senior African scholars around the world and hearing great ideas. But now that I look back, I realized that was, you couldn't put a price. There is no dollar amount on what it means to sit in front of that level of scholarship. And I'm not paying any speaker fees, anything. I'm just sitting there and I get to ask them my questions. It changed everything. And I mean, when I say everything, I mean everything. And I think if you talk to anybody who ran into that coalition of scholars who were helping us with that McKnight program, all of the McKnight fellows, especially those first two generations, have committed themselves to Africa-centered scholarship in some discipline or some area, and they're soldiers today.
That's phenomenal, Dr. Imani. The names that you called, for anybody that's truly a follower of Black studies, African-centered thought, you just named all of our most esteemed elders, most of them ancestors now. But so I would like to take this time to turn it formally over to you, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. I'm going to try to share my screen, and hopefully this is going to work. Those of you who work with virtual technology know sometimes it works perfectly until you have to use it, and then it doesn't work very well. So I'm going to try to start. Can you see that okay, Professor Hurd? Doing a quick check.
Yep, it's fine.
Okay, fantastic. All right. The title that I chose, and when you're an Africa-centered scholar, you have so much stuff you want to talk about that it's always dangerous to ask us to pick titles, because if we pick titles, it gets long. They usually give us 3 or 4 words, and then you can't get everything in there. So I took the privilege of being able to put my full title here. I call it My Yacht Blinded, and you may not understand that at the moment, but I'm just going to bracket that and say My Yacht Blinded, and then the substance is the Africana Views on the challenges of the loss of affirmative shame for the individual and the community. And so I'll just hop into it. This is our agenda. We're gonna, I have a little stuff about me and a little background, and then we'll start out with some breakout questions. So this is kind of our agenda for how we're gonna move through. That's more for me than all the rest of you, to keep me from wandering off. I'm at that special age, and I'm also a minister and a scholar. You get those two together, those of you know we could be in trouble. This is who I am, and this is a little bit of the bio you heard earlier. I do want to talk for a second about my background. As I said, my first 2 books were on, I'm all about institution building. My belief is that the reason African liberation, especially in the United States and the Western Hemisphere, sometimes doesn't go as far as some of us wished it had gone by this point, is that while we have radical ideas about social change and social progress for our community, and we've done a lot of that background, we have not built a lot of the social infrastructure and social institutions. African traditional society, African classical civilization is based on matching the institutions to the people. So if you're still in the institutions of your oppressors and your colonizers or neo-colonizers, and then you're trying to institute revolutionary Africana ideas, you're gonna have, pushback is not even the word. You're gonna have reactionary and counter-revolutionary progress, or retrogression, and that's kind of, I would argue, where we are. For example, if we look at, there's a lot of people that want to build independent, Black education or independent Africana education, and they're trying to do that in Eurocentric educational environments. And needless to say, they're making sometimes no progress, sometimes incremental, extremely slow incremental progress. And the idea that we should simply build our own educational institutions is something revolutionary. It's like, wow, how could we do that? And of course, one of the major things that happened to us during the enslavement and colonization process was that we were taught that we couldn't build anything. Part of my agenda is showing that we can build something because we already built something, and we're, in a sense, not building something for the first time, but rebuilding social institutions and structures that we had that were destroyed once we moved into oppression. My research follows Diop in many ways. I study classical African civilization, but I don't study it as kind of a history, the way a historian does. And I'm not really an anthropologist either, but I study it to find antecedents, examples, and models and concepts that can make a difference for Africana civilization today. All right, now let's get into the meat of today's broadcast, right? What is the role of the collective in classical African conceptions of justice? Contrary to popular belief, Europeans did not invent the concept of justice or law or order. African civilization had long ago mastered those concepts and those ideas. And I'm using classical North African civilization here, and I'm using Kemet, which is an indigenous African name for what's commonly called ancient Egypt. I don't use the term Egypt because Egyptos is a Greek term and actually dates us in terms of a historical time period in which the Greeks had colonized the area that is today known as Egypt. So I try to, since I'm talking about a different historical time period long before that, I use the term Kemet. And Kemet had a very serious kind of commitment to justice. Justice was presented in this concept, this deity known as Mayat, which is commonly spelled M-A-Y-A-T. and then there's an apostrophe AT. It's pronounced, the apostrophe is pronounced in English very close to this idea of a Y. So it's like mayat, a very light Y there, light in terms of the pronunciation. But this concept of justice is about balance and equilibrium, that the nature of the universe is balance and equilibrium. And most of us understand that if something happens to us, someone takes something from us, someone offends us, someone does something negative to us, what we want is justice. And justice means somehow they should undo it, they should correct it, they should restore the situation, the loss that we had prior to the offense that they committed to us. And so Africana conceptions of justice are about restoring the balance, the equilibrium, as much as possible, restoring the relationships, the positive relationships that we had before the injustice occurred. And so Mayat was this formula, if you will, for getting back to that balance and conception. Now, I want to contrast that for a minute from the Western conception of justice. I would argue that the West does not have a conception of justice. It has a conception of judicial procedure. Okay, that is to say, justice for example, if we use the United States as but one example, justice is the police arrest. Let's say someone steals your television. Okay, they stole your television, so they find out who it is. They arrest that person. They take them to a court, and a charge is filed for theft, and they're found guilty, and they go to jail. They pay a fine or whatever. Now, what's your situation? Your situation is that you lost your TV, right? So you can't watch your program, and you've lost the economic value. Well, what does the criminal procedure do about that? Absolutely nothing. In fact, the process might very well end there, with the person who comes out of jail having served the time may go home and they may still be watching your television. There is no restoration of the original situation. In this case, the situation that existed before your television was taken. Now, of course, you can file a civil claim, which you have to pay for and set up, and you go through another court, and that court may find that person responsible, and they probably are responsible if they're the one who stole your television. But even at the end of that process, you may find a judgment in which they're required to give you a certain amount of money or whatever. But if they didn't have any money or didn't have any resources, you still don't get the restoration of the situation as it dealt before. So restoration is not a very important principle in Western justice. And this is why very frequently when African people say no justice, no peace, and you'll hear the chant, and then European liberals will join in the movement and say no justice, no peace. They'll join in and we'll assume that we're all on the same page, but we're not really. A good example was if you take a situation like George Floyd, certainly African people call for justice, certainly non-African people call for justice. But here's the interesting thing. For people who are outside of the Africana context, when they call for justice, they're really talking about a miscarriage of procedure, that there was a set of procedures that law enforcement operate with. And the idea is that specific law enforcement officers violated that procedure, and their violation led to a crime, in this case, the death of George Floyd, and that they should be held accountable and go to jail. And if that all happens, then they'll say, great, justice was served. Meanwhile, African people are like, no, 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 no. George Floyd is not just about George Floyd or Officer A1, A, B, C, whatever. It is about the entire criminal justice system. It's about the entire law enforcement structure. It's about the fact that there is no restoration to justice. And that's really what we're looking for, which means that at the end of this process, someone asked me, what do you think is going to happen at the end of this George Floyd situation? I said, Africans are going to be dissatisfied. And people who are Eurocentrists are going to be wondering why they're dissatisfied, because the court cases are over and people have gone to jail and fines have been paid. And they're going to say, well, justice is served. No, it isn't, because there can be no restoration. The crime, if you will, is the denigration of African life. And until African life is valued and restored, and the processes necessary for that restoration are put in place, then there is no justice, at least from the Africa-centered perception. Now, what's the role of the collective? I just said a minute ago, I said, we talked about procedural justice in the Western world. Procedural justice is usually if you've ever been to court, you know that it's the state versus someone. The state, the governmental institution charges somebody with having violated the law. And so it's kind of an individual phenomenon. In the African conception, violations of the law, violations of the custom, violations of the community are collective violations. They are determined collectively, they are adjudicated collectively, they are punished or resolved collectively, they are restored collectively. So everything that's done in an African context, when there's a question of justice or question of disequilibrium or whatever, it is a collective question from the beginning. It may involve the actions of an individual or a group of individuals, but it is a collective situation. Mayat must be restored collectively, which takes us to the second point. What's the relationship between rights and responsibilities? In the Western world, one of the things associated with their process of justice is this notion of rights, the rights of the person offended versus the rights of the defendant. And we talk about, and if there's any dispute, it's often a dispute over rights. In the Africana context, the idea is that rights exist because and are connected to responsibilities. Let me give you an example. If I'm in a traditional Africana context, I'm going to have to ask permission from an elder to speak in the communal gathering. Now, you may say, well, gosh, Dr. Imani, you're a minister, you're a PhD, you're a grown man. Why are you asking permission to speak? It almost makes you feel childlike or whatever. Well, the idea is that speech is not free. It's not this thing that just suddenly exists simply because I have a mouth and I have something to say. Speech is a right extended by the collective. What good is my speech unless all of you are going to listen, right? So my speech freedom, if you want to call it that, or my speech right is connected to your willingness to listen, your willingness to hear what I have to say, your willingness to respond. As I often tell my students, I can't be a teacher if there's no students. It makes no sense, because the teacher without students, the general without the army, without the collective, then the rights I'm talking about make no sense, because I'd just be talking to myself. And so the right of free speech being a collective right, it is the responsibility of the collective to decide what it is that I'm going to have to say, whether that's going to be something positive or negative. So the reason I'm going to ask for permission is that I'm going to ask an elder in that particular community, do I have permission to speak? And they're going to look at me, my family, my tradition, my actions in the past. They're going to do a survey of all of that. And they're going to decide, is Dr. Imani likely to say something positive and validating and in the interest of the community, or is he likely to say something that's disrespectful, discordant, that's going to cause conflict and misunderstanding? And if they decide the latter, then they'll deny me the right to speak. If they decide the former, they'll give me the right to speak. And then the minute I engage the speech act to this collective, I then have a responsibility. And my responsibility is to, in fact, do things that are positive. So that means that African art, African literature, African institutions, African politics, everything has to be subjected to this test, not a test of rights. I have a right to do this, I have a right to do, but a test of responsibilities. Have I, in engaging my art, in engaging my speech, in engaging my teaching, or whatever it is, have I actually done things that raise up the community, raise up the youth? Am I doing something that is life affirming from an Africana perspective, or life destroying? Now, takes us to question 3. What is the role of shame? In the Western world, shame is a bad thing. In fact, one of all of the books I read in Western psychology about shame is kind of associated with bullying, and shame is kind of going up to somebody, say lower income, and they're not wearing designer clothes, and you say, look at these ugly clothes, and you make the person feel bad about it, and that's shaming them, and that's associated with bullying. And so if you read any Western psychology books, they'll tell you get rid of shame. Nobody wants to shame anybody. Well, I agree that there's bullying, but that's not really an Africana concept of shame. And one of the things I've always said is that if we are ever going to be free as a collective, we have to be free cognitively, free conceptually. We have to stop thinking that the Eurocentric definition of something is the universal definition. There's nothing wrong with the Eurocentric definition for them, but the problem is when you start turning their definition and their characterization into yours and everybody else's on the planet. So the Western world obviously sees shame as this act of bullying to hurt the person, to make them feel bad about who they are. That's not the African conception. Many of the African words for shame actually translate into correction. In ancient North African civilization, there's a concept known as isfet. And isfet is kind of the opposite or the inverse of mayat. Mayat then meaning balance or equilibrium, isfet meaning disorder, disequilibrium, imbalance, right? Dis-ease, to use that term. And shame is an important element of that. First, shame allows you to recognize that the equilibrium has been breached. Shame also neutralizes or corrects the offense or points in the direction of something that can correct the offense. If you lose shame in that context, you will probably not recognize what you're doing is offensive or wrong, and you probably won't correct it. On the left-hand side of my diagram here, I have an old part of the hieroglyph from Kemet. And, I'm not going to deal with all the elements, but basically what you have here is you have a picture of what's considered the afterlife. And you have the heart of an individual being weighed. This is kind of on the extreme left. It's a little cut off in the diagram, but the heart is being weighed, and it's being weighed against a feather. And the important spiritual significance of that is that if we are burdened with corruption and things that are shameful, then our hearts become heavy. They become a burden to us. And so the idea is that if you were to take out your spiritual heart and to put it on this scale, and you had a lot of such things, a lot of things that were shameful and not respectful to your community and yourself, then your heart would be heavy. And of course, the heart would then sink in the balance. On the other hand, if that's not the case, the heart would be lighter. And you'll notice that a feather, if you think about the weight of a feather is very light. So the idea is that our hearts should be light because they should be filled with love and mercy and charity and positive things, not the things of shame. And the idea is that if, in fact, the person's heart is positively weighed in that regard, then they get to enter the afterlife and a positive next cycle of existence, as opposed to being punished or being stigmatized. Now, that process is overseen. If you look in the hieroglyph, you'll see at the top of the hieroglyph, you have a group there. There's a group of people, and you'll see they're alternate, kind of from white to darker colors. That group is it represents the spiritual ancestors, the spiritual collective. So this is the people who have passed on into the spiritual realm, and they're the ones kind of overseeing this judicial process, making sure that the balance is maintained between positivity and corruption. And you could not have this procedure without them. Africans do not have procedures without inviting their ancestors and without putting their elders in a place of prominence, because the elders and the ancestors are the ones who are going to oversee, to make sure that this process of mayat is kept in balance. Now, what's important about that is I want to emphasize that word see. Remember when I said the title of my presentation was Mayat Blinded. Some of you have seen Mayat before. The West modeled its great societies and great cities on ancient Kemet in many ways. If you go to Washington, D.C., which I call Banneker City because it was laid out mostly by Benjamin Banneker, you will see that that city, that national capital, is laid out in the way the ancient cities, spiritual cities of Kemet were laid out, with the rotunda and the Pharaoh's house, which would be the White House, and then you have the obelisk, which would be the Washington Monument. So in a sense, all of the symbols in Washington, D.C. were emulations of ancient African power and authority. What's interesting, though, is that they also had Mayat. Mayat was depicted as in several ways. One of the ways was a woman with a set of scales. She was actually holding the scales that are being used to weigh the heart here. She walked around with the scales. Now, what's important is that, as far as I know of, she had 20/20 vision. Okay, that would make sense. If I told you, if I hit you a pair of scales and I asked you to weigh two things, in order for you to make an adequate assessment as to whether those two things are in equilibrium with each other, you need to be able to see the scales, right? Because now, if you can't see, if you're actually blind or partially blind, then you're not going to be certain in terms of what I put in the scales. Did I put my finger in the scale and lean it one way or another? Are the scales balanced? You can't make any of those determinations if you are blind. You'll notice that Maat reemerges in the Western world in a figure known as Libra. Libra associated with liberty or freedom. And so the idea is that justice is connected to liberty or freedom. But the problem with Lady Liberty, those of you who have been watching her know that she suffered a tragic accident. I don't know what happened, but somehow her eyes got messed up and they put this blindfold around her eyes. So she's Maat and she's still got her scales, but she can't see anything. In fact, that concept is called blind justice. And in the Western world, the idea that justice is blind is actually seen as something positive, that blind justice means that we all get justice without condition. But the problem is, if I can't see that people have different economic resources, that they have different social classes, they have different cultures, they have different religions, they have different stuff. If I can't see any of that, and I act as if every single person is coming from the same place with the same circumstance, to use the Western scientific term, all things being equal, the only problem is all things are not and have never been equal. It means that I'm going to end up with some kind of procedural justice that may not actually remove Isfet and restore Maat. I may be left, in fact, I may end up with a justice system that itself is unjust and actually increases injustice over time. Some of you who've studied the justice system probably know what I'm talking about right about now. All right, so what are the standards, right? The standards of Maat, because Maat has to have some standards if we're going to evaluate. And that's another thing in the Western world. There's this idea that the standards are kind of what you make them to be, right? It's my right to define what I want to say and what I want to do. And it's your obligation to refrain from interfering with my right. And it makes it really, really difficult to govern ethical behavior, because the idea is that unless the ethical behavior reaches an extreme level, like a murder or something on the end, almost everything short of that is allowed. A good example is if you look at racist speech. Racist speech is hurtful, it's psychologically damaging, it destroys relationship, it destroys societies. But basically, under Western law, you know, the idea is that, you know, you have freedom of speech, and so you can be racist or whatever in your speech. And nobody can really correct that. And if you try to correct that, well, that's a violation of your rights. But rights there are being presented without responsibility. So what are your responsibilities? Here you have the 42 divine principles of Maat. There's actually more than these, but the 42 are probably among the most famous. And you'll see here, I'm not going to read them all, but they should look familiar to you. I've not been sinful. I haven't robbed anybody, haven't stolen anything. I don't steal food. I don't take offerings. I don't take from God. I don't disobey law. I don't tell lies. I don't curse. I don't pollute myself, all of these kind of things. And you can see that if you were able as a human being to follow most or all of these, you'd be a pretty good person. And if we were to weigh your heart, again, your spiritual heart is pretty good. On the other hand, if you broke a lot of these, then you'd have the heavy heart and you wouldn't be able to ascend. You see the goddess Maat here. She's depicted with her wings. The wings embrace you. The idea is that you're protected by these principles. Obviously, if we live in a society where people live according to these principles, we're going to have a much better society than if we have a society where people disobey all these principles. And at the top of her crown, she has that feather we were talking about, which means, you know, kind of denotes the fact that she's going to be the one weighing and measuring things and assessing whether or not we've done them. Now, she is the masculine principle. There's also a, feminine principle. The masculine principle is Tahuti or Thoth. And he also maintains these principles, and he uses a instrument called the caduceus. And some of you have seen the caduceus. It's a symbol of law. It's a symbol of medicine, and it's also the symbol of barbery, right? The barbershop. And the idea is that you have these two serpents that are wrapped around a pole, one representing the spiritual dimension, the other representing the physical dimension. And the idea is that they're in balance. So your perfect state in medicine is equilibrium between your spirit and your body, right? And your perfect state in law is a law that that meets the material requirements of the society and also makes sure that the spiritual needs of society are met. On the left-hand side here, we have the 42 principles that are actually written out. And you'll notice that again, we have the collective, right? The collective, the ancestors who are sitting there, making sure, doing the assessment that what you're doing is consistent with the values. So those are the important principles. The idea that we have standards. The standards are evaluated collectively. They are evaluated collectively under the system of elders and ancestors. And the goal of these responsibilities is to make sure that we've created an environment conducive to human life and spiritual development. Now, this is alluded to in the Western biblical tradition, but it's totally misunderstood. Turn the other cheek is an African traditional concept, and we hear that term, turn the other cheek, and somehow in the Western term, the idea of turn the other cheek means that if someone is hitting you or beating you or disrespecting you, you just let that happen. In fact, maybe you turn around and the side that they didn't beat or disrespect, you let them beat that side too. Now that may work in a slave theology, but that's actually not what that is. The Western biblical tradition actually comes from Africa, and I don't want to get into that whole thing, but let me just point out that for most of the biblical texts, you're in Ethiopia, Egypt, and Somalia, and you stay there for a very long time. But somehow in the Western imagination, you move somewhere else where there's some Europeans. I don't know how that happened, but in any case, I've managed to put the African biblical text back in Africa, amazingly enough. And so that means when I look at the concepts and the ideas and the metaphors, I'm looking at African concepts. Turn the other cheek refers to a ritual. One of the common rituals in the African traditional society was the ritual of shaming. It was affirmative shaming. Now, what do I mean by affirmative shaming? Well, negative shaming is the kind of shaming we were talking about earlier, where the goal is to make you feel bad about who you are and so forth. Affirmative shaming is to mark out that you violated the collective principles of Maat and you need to modify your behavior. One of the things that commonly happens is that after we've discussed what you've done, the elders in the community stand up and they turn away from you. They turn away. It's not that they're rejecting you, but they're rejecting the corruption in Maat that you have brought about as a result of your words or your actions. They turn away from you. They will not look upon you. This metaphor also extends in the biblical tradition to the part where Jesus takes on the sin of mankind. And there's a moment where the idea is that God cannot look upon the Son because the Son is now corrupted by all of the sin that he has taken for humanity. And he says, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani, which is, my God, have you forsaken me? The idea is that God himself turns away from the offense, not from the Son, but from the offense. And this individual, when they turn away from you, you are basically persona non grata in the African community until you have engaged in restorative justice. And so you've got to engage in a set of rituals and actions, material and spiritual, that will restore the balance. When the balance is restored, the elders will turn back around and then they will face you. The greatest penalty in the African context then is not incarceration, but exile. The goal in African society is restoration of human relationships, not sending people away to a jail cell where they get treated like an animal and then begin to act like animals, as in the Western model, but actually to have the individual remain in the community, perform services and acts for the community that restore trust and love and balance and equilibrium so that they are then removed from social exile. Again, the goal is Maat, restoration, not separation. So here's my hypothesis. After going through all of that, I said, the first problem we have is that the ideology of individualism is corrosive to the African concept of collective selfhood, and it undermines affirmative shame. This glorification, I know that we're all individuals, right? The African society recognizes that we are individual persons, but it argues that our individual personhood is connected to who we are and what we do and where we have come from. I am because we are because I am. So it's collective. My selfhood is collective. It would be a very strange thing in an African traditional concept for me to say I'm a self-made man, or someone, a woman, to say I'm a self-made woman. That would be really strange kind of language, not the words, but the conception. Because the idea is that I am the embodiment of my parents, my ancestors, my community, my village, my ethnic group, and so forth. And all of that is part of who I am. I'm a manifestation of that same eternal process of Africaneity that they are. And so that means that my actions, my deeds, everything I do is assessed and evaluated, not strictly with reference to what I want to do, right? That Nike, by the way, is the name of a Greek goddess. And Nike was the goddess of doing things without consequences, which is why Nike has that slogan, just do it. African society wasn't just do it. It was do what is right, what is moral, what constructs life rather than what destroys life. And then you become ashamed of doing, saying, and engaging in ways that undermine life, the life of the community. And of course, undermining the life of the community is undermining your own life as well. If you're engaged in that process, then you're engaged in a kind of process of self-negation as well. And if you lose affirmative shame, if you lose that concept, then basically what happens is people are inclined to do almost anything and say, well, this has nothing to do. You're going to have artists who produce anything and say anything, and they're going to say it's okay. You're going to have criminals who engage in activity that's extremely destructive, and they're not going to feel any sense of responsibility. You're going to have a breakdown of the family because the relationship between parents and children, or between young adults and older adults, all of the infrastructure of the Africana community is going to go down if you cannot be, if you no longer have that sense of obligation that what I do, say, and how I engage the world must be in a way that does not cause shame for my community, my collective, my parents, and so forth. The greatest thing, or the greatest punishment, I guess, my parents ever gave me was a situation that I was involved in where my father said to me, son, I'm ashamed of you. Now, you know, you could discipline me with corporal punishment. You could take away some of my conveniences. But when my father said he was ashamed of me because of my actions, and I had brought shame on him and shame on the family and so forth, that exercised an impact that I can't even explain to you in words. And I did everything I could that I could think of in my limited knowledge to try to restore the balance, the equilibrium of the relationship between me, my parents, my community. I wanted to undo the shame, undoing the shame meaning to restore the equilibrium. The second thing I have here is the restoration of the concept of affirmative shame. If I'm right with my hypothesis up there, then my follow-up, my corollary, then restoring affirmative shame is central to the reconstitution of Mayat and proper Africana agency, meaning that if we are going to do something about some of the negative social behaviors and cultural productions and other things in the community, we must restore the concept of shame. We must reject this Eurocentric attitude of condemning shame and say, no, wait a minute. You should be ashamed of certain actions, certain words, certain behaviors. And that shame should then motivate you to A, stop and cease and desist from the behavior, and B, to want to modify the behavior in a righteous direction. There's also this thing called guilt. Guilt is the individual sense of responsibility in the Eurocentric world. Guilt is considered constructive. In fact, in the Western world, sometimes the guilty are the biggest heroes. I'm thinking of the Trump era, and I'm thinking of all of the people in the Wild Wild West, and I'm thinking of many of the great colonizers and conquistadors and other people that are held up as heroes when we know historically they did horrible things. But the idea somehow is that even though they bear individual guilt, that's you know, it's almost as though the fact that they got away with it and they weren't punished is something laudable. You know, the kind of anti-hero concept. On the other hand, shame is seen as a collective sense of responsibility. And in the Eurocentric world, shame is considered a hindrance to the individual. In the African-centered context, these are reversed, meaning that it's not my individual guilt that's the problem, because I can walk around with individual guilt, but that doesn't mean I'm going to modify my behavior. Collective shame is important because what that does is that applies collective correction, collective principles of correction and restoration to my behavior. It's quite possible that I could be guilty the rest of my life and continue to do things, but it's not really possible, at least from an Africana standpoint, that I can continue to endure shame. I'm going to want to do something to be out of a position of shame. And in the Western world, our people are set up in socialization processes that undermine shame as a concept. Key takeaways. The basis of law, justice, order, and balance in Africana societies is collective. The rights of the individual spring from responsibilities to the collective. The individual is accountable to the collective, and shame is the indicator and the corrective component for restoration. The loss of shame is a critical element in the decline of Africana social order. These are your considerations if you're using a shame model, affirmative shame model, right? Are my actions, thoughts, and words respective of humanity and the process of life itself? Are my actions, thoughts, and words respective of one's own cultural collective, in this case, African people? Number 3, are my actions, thoughts, and words reflective of one's collective self? That is to say, is this of honor to my parents, my grandparents, my ancestors, my immediate family lineage? If the answer is no to either 1, 2, or 3, or some combination thereof, shame compels me to modify my behavior. The absence of shame means that I'm going to continue on with that pattern of behavior, either because I'm ignorant that it's wrong, or because I've been taught or mistaught that it doesn't matter. Call to action. I always conclude my research with, what do we do about this? Number 1, I have recommended the creation of elder circles for all our organizations. All of our organizations should have a council of elders, people who, and council of elders doesn't just mean older people. It means people who have experience in whatever issues or matters that the particular organization is going to focus on, and that you need elders, and you need to consult with those elders and give them the authority to make sure that they can guide the organization according to the principles of Mayat. The other is the restoration of rites of passage. One of the places in African traditional society where youth would learn about collective shame and learn about their responsibilities to the collective is in this thing called rites of passage. At each stage of the human life, African traditional societies would mark the change. It's a lot like the kind of bar mitzvah or the graduation ceremony. In this case, the graduation is a spiritual and mental and physical graduation from adolescence into adulthood. And part of what you learned was your sense of obligations to the community. So when my grandmother was saying, what are you going to do for the people? In her own small, insignificant way, she was imposing on me a rite of passage. She's saying that now that you are reaching the age of maturity, you now have the responsibility, the obligation to do something for your people that's positive. And I want to know what you're going to do. And I'm going to hold you accountable, because I actually have to answer her question as my elder, and also, of course, as my grandmother. All righty. So that's who I am. And that's what I've been talking about. This is my phone number and my email, and I'm happy to share that in the chat if it goes by too quick. I thank you very much for listening to my little spiel. I hope it's been useful to you, and I'll sit back, relax, and wait for your comments and questions.
Thank you, Dr. Imani. That was fascinating. It was really, really, I think it's something that we are at a point where we really have to sit back and consider this whole discussion, because we were just in such our communities are in such turmoil. And looking not just here, but just around the world, we can think about all the ways in which we're falling away from our standards. So I guess, and you did leave us with some ways that we can follow up, but I wonder if you can speak to the issue of the family structure, because like you said, your grandmother held you to that standard. And, you and I grew up at a time where we were surrounded by family. The family just was not the quote unquote nuclear family. Like, people don't they grew up particularly in the South, but in Southern type households, understand that the family is not that quote unquote nuclear family. You know, family is, you know, could be one or both parents, but it was grandma, possibly grandpa, aunts, uncles, cousins who were like brothers and sisters. They're your play cousins, you know, so the neighbor down the street who was your play auntie, the community was your family. As people migrated away from their homes, you know, during the Great Migration, seeking better opportunities, they moved away from that support structure, and the family broke down as that support structure that had always existed. So how do we get back to that point? How do we restore that structure that provided that standard for us in these settings in which we don't have that family structure?
One of the things I've suggested is that we sometimes approach that particular problem as if it's the first time, but the value of studying African history is we did this before. And when I say we did this before, you may remember that the enslavement process destroyed our families in a certain way, right? It didn't destroy them as much physically. That is to say, we were still there and still related, but it destroyed our ability to exercise that traditional Africana family role. And so we created in North African civilization, they call it scaffolding. I'm going to talk about architecture for a minute. We often wonder, how do you build the kumti, which they call pyramids? But how do you build these huge structures with a limited number of people? The Africans had an approach, and I've learned to, I refer to that approach as scaffolding, which is, okay, you need to get up 100 feet high. Now, that's not something that you're going to be able to do. You can't just walk up and suddenly be 100 feet. So what ends up happening is that we start scaffolding, which means that each person holds a section of the structure, and then the next section of the structure is built on top of that, built on top of that. And you climb to the top of the scaffolding. Thus, you rest on the shoulders of everybody else. Now, what does that mean in a community context? We created fictive kin, right? You couldn't be with mama or auntie or grandmama because they got sold off to another plantation. So our people immediately after slavery, and this is not studied enough, we created a new family structure. The family structure we're now calling the African family is the new one we created after slavery, where, you know, you had uncles that were not, now you don't have uncle, right? But you have somebody who has agreed to step in and play uncle role. So that's a fictive kin role. We call it fictive kin, right? Because they're not really biologically, but they're going to step in. I had so many uncles. Many of the uncles I had coming up were not biological uncles. They were folks that were uncles, and I had uncle obligations and they had nephew obligations to me. And so now they accepted those responsibilities, and I accepted that role, and I was reared in that. Now, so what do we do now? I would argue that we need to scaffold, which means we need to, in those areas where we do not have fathers, let's have, just like we used to call them other mothers, let's have other fathers. Let's have elder men who are willing to step into the role we call the Baba role. And Baba wasn't just the term of just being a biological father, it meant father of the children. So if you're willing to be a father of the child, right, then you become the father for groups of children, and you become the mentor, and we can have other fathers, other grandmas, other nana is grandma, other, you know, and I think we build this scaffolding by among those of us who are, you know, conscious enough and aware to do it. And then what we do with that scaffolding is we support families, and this is where I think the rites of passage comes in. We make sure that the next generation comes up with the scaffolding so that for them, this appears normal. That's what happened. The fictive kin, after a couple of generations, nobody knew the difference between the fictive kin and the actual kin because it was functioning the way it was supposed to function. We need to do that again. Got to do it again. African history is all about again. So again, what we've got to do is we've got to get the other fathers, the other mothers, the other aunties, we come in, we scaffold around the mothers of children, those who don't have that structure. And then what happens is part of our mentoring process is mentoring them so that their children and their children's children actually grow up with that support network. And for them, it will be just as natural. But now what we do not do is wait on the oppressor to do anything. And I hate to say it, but that was my big beef with the legacy of the civil rights movement. I applaud it for its role in deconstructing legal segregation, which was an abomination. But, you know, I tell people I'm a strong desegregationalist, but I'm not an integrationist. I believe fundamentally that the desegregation, we were being freed from a legal bondage, which would allow us then to do for ourselves. Instead, we went from a legal bondage to another kind of psychological and legal bondage that relied on, that taught us that we had to rely on others to do what we can do and had done previously for ourselves. And I think that the salvation of the African family has to be by African people.
All right, so we have a question in the Q&A. With traditions like that, how do you explain the turmoil in countries on the African continent today? So for example, Sudan, Congo, Ethiopia, Tigray.
If you read, if you're familiar with what was called, Masri writes a lot about the tripartite heritage of Africa. So the Africa you're looking at is not ancient Africa, okay? And I know we all know that at some level, but that's actually a significant statement that Africans, Kwame Ture said one time, we have striven to become those least like ourselves, and we have succeeded. Okay, so if you take that meaning that while I'm over here trying to be a European American male, whatever that is, that I can't be, and I'm on that mission impossible, my brother over in many parts of the African continent is trying to be British or French or from Dutch or Belgian, and has learned that those values and those cultural things, and especially in the elites and the leadership, the ones who are building institutions, maintaining institutions, a lot of them are as thoroughly colonized on a cognitive level as you possibly. So if you look at many parts of Africa today, traditional Africa was invaded and subjected to colonialism, and so as a result, many of the traditionalists, there's still battles being fought really between traditionalism and colonial and neo-colonial influences in Africa. We forget that war isn't over. That war is still being fought in the same way that King and X and Harriet Tubman and Nat Turner had to fight war here. You know, even with citizenship and everything, they still got, and we still at it, right? We still call it the struggle. The struggle continues. Well, in Africa, the struggle continues. And I think the mistake we make is that as much as I love Mother Africa was victimized by the enslavement process, victimized it because it took some of the best and brightest out of Africa and brought us over here. It separated us. It colonized them and created an elite that was normed in Eurocentric values. And now the Chinese are beginning to fill that role. And so what you've got is we're still in the struggle. Now, if you look in Africa, and my first two books were grounded in the Bantu of Southern Africa and whatever, if you look in traditional villages and other places, you will see the trends I'm talking about. And there are some things that are working. But I think a lot of times, if you look at urban Africa and you start to look at these very, very kind of neo-colonized areas, you're going to see the same kind of behavior that you see here. And the necessities for them are the same as the necessities for us. And what I grieve about is that both groups, that is, have been so misled about each other. The Africans in the Western Hemisphere and the Africans on the continent have been so buffaloed with these false narratives about each other that rather than getting together to constitute a global African community, we spend a lot of time vilifying each other.
All right, so there is a comment and question in the chat. I consider that the United States, North and South America were the site of a crime from the very first day and continuing crime. So the US is built on criminality. Working with the tenants group and going to the Douglas County Courthouse many, many days, I see on the calendar every day, hundreds and hundreds of people and organizations indicted, tried, and likely convicted. How does a vision of Maat remotely get a foothold in a culture of such overwhelming criminality?
Well, part of it has got to be the objective, okay? And I hate to say this, but I always get down to brass tacks. Is your goal integration or freedom? And I mean, we dance around that question, but most of the leaders of the African American community are not fighting for freedom. They are trying desperately to find a window inside the plantation with a comfortable room and a blanket for us to stay in, okay? There are some of us that are not, that is not our objective. It never was, but there are some that are deeply committed to that. And so my thing is this. One of the things that's going on right now is private jails, right? One of the major features in the Western world is the commodification of jails, the treatment of people in jail as capitalist products to be exploited. Okay, now, if you are of a non-revolutionary mentality, you're trying to figure out how do we stop this and change what they're doing into what it should be. I would argue you're not going to. For me, that's mission impossible. Your mission if you choose to accept it. My thing is this. I've been trying to tell brothers and sisters, why don't we open up a prison? And let me explain what I mean. We can call it a prison, right? That's what we have to call it from legal terms. But we begin to get our own people, and we know it'll be disproportionately a bunch of our own people, and get them into a new institution. The state just wants to get rid of them and dump them somewhere. So dump them in my hands. And then what we're going to do is we're going to put all the processes of whether it's male development, female development, family support, all this stuff we talk about, this revolutionary stuff we talk about, can be implemented inside those walls. How many people know what's going on right now inside a prison? I mean, if you think about it, Americans spend more money for prisons than any other institution, more money than schools, more money than childcare, more money than healthcare. It all goes in a prison, and your money goes in there. You don't know what's going on. You might get a movie every now and then, and you might have some narrative that it's unjust or ingest, but you really don't know. You don't visit it. You don't go there. You just know some bad people there. Okay. That can work to our advantage if we think about looking at some of these institutions and using them for transformative things. I say the same thing with schools. Charter schools, let's stop. We got the liberals fighting the charter school movement because they're trying to get into somebody else's school. My argument is, you're gonna let me have a school where I can teach my own kids? Thank you. Thank you so much. But you're gonna need revolutionaries who change their mentality. My mentality is neither to get into someone else's system or to get them to change what they're doing. Their system was normed on their culture, and it's designed to preserve their civilization. I'm busy over here trying to figure out if we can build some institutions that are normed on our culture that will sustain our civilization. And that is, it's a different agenda, it's a different effort. And I think that's where our energies need to be. And that's a political issue. I recognize that there are some folks that desperately want to be integrated. And I don't hate them. I love them. They're my brothers and sisters. But I think they're kind of on a fool's errand. And I'm trying to prepare for those who either by circumstance or by conscious choice realize that we're gonna need to do something else. I'm trying to be the something else when it finally dawns on us that it's not working. And by the way, the people who run this system are realizing it isn't working. If you really look and you read a lot of books about Western civilization, they're like, our school systems are failing. Our healthcare system is failing. Okay, if something is failing, if you knew my house was about to collapse, are you trying to get in? I just asked the question. So nobody else has to, Professor Hurd, I asked.
All right, so that looks like all of our questions.
Okay.
And it looks like we've reached our time, but I really want to thank you. So this isn't the end of this discussion. You've raised some critical issues that we need to continue to discuss and hash out. It takes a long time to rebuild, but you have raised, I mean, I don't think I've ever heard anybody say, let's own a prison, so that's a fascinating concept to even just to think about. But yeah, so I want to thank you for your work and your presentation. I want to let everybody know that our next faculty lecture will be Tuesday, November 16th at 4 o'clock, featuring Professor Preston Love Jr., who will be talking about remembering the past face to face with our youth. So it's an intergenerational conversation about his Black History tour that he takes students on every year. And we also have something coming up, a special event that we'll be hosting on November 11th. I just ask that you would watch on our website and watch your emails for the details once it becomes available. But again, I want to thank all of you for watching and participating, and have a good afternoon.